from really pretty much the 1812 war. The French were willing to sell it to the United States. Why did the French need to sell the land for it? Well, who did I say the French were fighting?
The British.
British. So they needed money to support themselves in battle, so they sold the land to the United States, and we got the property of the Louisiana Purchase. All right. Yes, or last week's questions. Does anybody have the answer to them?
Francis Scott Key and Fort McHenry.
Very good. Fort McHenry was the fort the flag was flying, which in Washington, D.C., they have the flag there at the Smithsonian hanging. They refixed it, or they touched it up, done a really good work fixing that up. And then Francis Scott Key, who wrote the national anthem. All right. This week is about the Texas Revolution and the Mexican War. All right. Texas Revolution was from October 2nd of 1836 or 1835 to April 21st, 1836. Began with the colonists. So we're still called colonists, like we were during the American Revolution, but we're moving west now. And we're moving west to Texas. Now, who owns Texas at the time? Mexico. Okay, Mexico owns Texas. All right, so we're moving. But when we're moving, so is slavery. We're moving south, whereas in the south they were slavery. They kept on moving farther out. Slavery kept on following them. Well, the Mexicans didn't look at slavery as, they didn't like it. They didn't approve with it, so they were always bullying the colonists, the Americans who were going there. You need to get rid of them. But they're like, no, we can do what we want. So there's a lot of headbutting at the time that started. The Texas rebelled against the centralist Mexican government. After a decade of political and cultural clashes between the Mexican government and increasingly large population of American settlers in Texas, hostilities erupted in October of 1835. The name that the Mexicans gave the Americans who were living there were Texicans. That was the names that they gave them. In the movie The Alamo, they even say that. And you still go out to Texas, I've heard people say that as a slang word for Americans who are not, or people who are not from Texas, or from Texas. Someone who moves there, they call them Texans. Texans disagreed whether the ultimate goal of independence or a return to Mexican Constitution of 1824, while delegates of the Constitution debates the war motives. The Texans and a flood of volunteers from the United States defeated the small garrison of Mexican soldiers in mid-December 1835. Okay, so what they're doing is they're moving, and they're really not part of the United States because Mexico owns it. But they're talking about, well, maybe we should make Texas our own country or a state. So they're going to have to decide, but the Mexicans are going to start fighting against them. And they start coming with their government and their soldiers, and they're going to start taking over and burning the villages and trying to move them out of Texas. Because if you don't go by their rules, they're going to kick you out. The Constitution from Mexico declined to declare independence and installed an interim government whose infighting led to political paralyzing of dearth and effective governance in Texas. An ill-conceived proposal to invade much needed volunteers to hold the country, or hold Texas together, the Texas Army. And in March of 1836, a convention declared independence, appointed leadership to the new Republic of Texas. So they're getting together, just like we did in the American Revolution. They started having their groups from all the Texicans that were living there come together. The U.S. government was watching to see what was going to happen. And they kind of kept quiet. And there's one gentleman who's there, or who's hearing about this, and his name's Henry Clay from Kentucky, and Andrew Jackson, and he was back in the politics after his presidency, and a guy from Tennessee. Anybody know his name? You don't know? No?
Davy Crockett.
Davy Crockett. Davy Crockett was in Congress at the time, and he was there, but he was paying attention. He says, well, these people were fighting for something they believe in, so let's kind of pay attention what they're listening to and see what happens. Determined the avenge of Mexican honor, the President Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna vowed to personally retake Texas, and his army of operatives entered Texas in mid-February of 1836, found the Texans completely unprepared. Well, they didn't really have an army there, so they were mostly militia units or town militia, which were a small group of guys who were together trying to fight off a bigger army. Santa Anna was the overall, he was the president of Mexico, and he was the general of all the forces in Mexico. One of the battles that he wound up facing was the Golad campaign and the Texas coast, defeating the Texan troops in his path and executing most of those who surrendered. So he was fighting them, and they didn't give up any prisoners. He didn't want prisoners. He said, if I kill them on sight, even prisoners, they'll leave. Well, this starts an uproar in Congress, the United States, and the people of Texas. Santa Anna led a large force in San Antonio, where the troops defeated a Texan garrison in the Battle of the Alamo, killing almost all the defenders. Okay? So that was one of the battles where he had more men than what they had at the Alamo. Alamo was a church first, and then it was used as a fort. But when you go there, you see the what's left of the ruins of the church, but the whole town that was around there was considered the Alamo, the outskirts of the area. But when you go there today, all there stands is the church. And there is not a basement to the Alamo, if anyone ever asks you that. For the next month, a newly created Texans army under the command of Sam Houston. Now, Sam Houston would eventually lead all the troops, the American troops that were coming from the United States out west, and the troops that were in Texas. So he was ahead of all of them. Steadily retreated. After he heard what happened at the Alamo, St. Anna started chasing him. And he says, we will destroy him. So he retreated towards the border of Louisiana. Now, think of the state of Texas and where they're at, San Antonio. That's quite a bit of a distance all the way to Louisiana. So they were scared. They kept on pushing them and pushing them farther back. Sam Houston steadily retreated toward the border of Louisiana, and terrified civilians fled with him and his army in a melee north and the runaway scrape. On March 31st, Houston paused his men at Gross Landing at the Brazos River for the next 2 weeks. The Texans received military training, becoming confident and underestimating the strength of his foes. Santa Anna further subdivided his troops. So what Santa Anna did was he split his troops up. Well, no one really knows why. He just felt he did not respect what army was in front of him, Sam Houston and his army at the time. So he split his group up. One went farther north, was going to come around, flank them from the south, or flank them from the right. The other group got stuck in some mud because of weather. So St. Anna had he actually had more men than Houston did, but he just never took them seriously what they had. Becoming incompetent and underestimating the strength of foes, St. Anna further subdivided in his troops. On April 21st, Houston's army staged a surprise assault on St. Anna and vanguarded forces of the Battle of San Jacinto. The Mexican troops were quickly routed, and vengefully Texans executed many who tried to surrender. St. Anna was taken hostage. In exchange for his life, he ordered the Mexican army to retreat south to Rio Grande. Mexico refused to recognize the Republic of Texas, and intermediate conflicts between the two nations continued in the 1840s. The annexions of the Texas was to the United States, with the 28th state to the United States on the flag in 1845, which directly led to the Mexican-American War. So, after that battle, he pretty much, Sam Houston hit him. He had Mexicans that were on his side, he had Indians, he had the Americans who were living there, small army of troops that did come from the government. They were trying to stay out of it, and they hit St. Anna, which I said he was split up, but he didn't take them seriously. He gave his men time to rest, take it easy, but they were unprepared. And they had an open field of the battle where they just stood there, and pretty much Houston just came and attacked them. And he hit them hard. And what soldiers were with him, they didn't give up, and they just pushed them all the way back to a creek, or actually a river, and massacred even the troops that were trying to surrender. So now they got their independence. Sam Houston becomes the president of the Republic of Texas. Well, the United States you're still now you're part of the United States, but we'll still recognize you, but you're really not your own country. And they fought with that all the way till the Civil War. So they wanted to be their own be their own country. And Sam Houston really fought that. So we'll go back to talk about the Alamo. Where's the Alamo at? It's in Texas. What city? Is there any basketball fans there in here? There's a team that plays there. Spurs? San Antonio. San Antonio is where the Alamo's at. And it's still standing, they still do reenactments, and they have their whole thing. Well, one of the commanding officers there, they had a very small force that were protecting this, his name was Travis. And not much was written about him, what I could find that was really interesting. He was a gambler. He left his family. Before he left, he actually owned a slave, refused to give him his rights to be free. He actually gave his child up to another family because he was going to the Alamo. And people really looked down on him because at that time if you were getting divorced or things like that, it was not a thing you talked about. You did it, and it really was not a good thing to talk about at that time. He was also a gambler, but he was strict with his men. On the other hand, you had Jim Bowie, the gambler, married a Spanish woman pretty close to the Alamo area in San Antonio. He got in fights in Louisiana. He was actually wanted a couple of times in the United States, and that's the reason they think he went farther west. For a fight he was in Louisiana, gambling. Gentleman said he was cheating at card game. Gentleman pulls his Derringer small pistol out, shoots him. And then he takes a knife and stabs him. And another gentleman takes his pistol out and shoots him. So now he's been shot twice and stabbed. And Jim Bowie was known for what they call the Bowie knife. which was about this big. Big handle, and he went up and killed both those men, stabbed them. That was the reason they were looking for him afterwards, and that's why they think he went out to Mexico or into Texas. The other gentleman that was here at the Alamo, Davy Crockett, from Tennessee. So he was paying attention the whole time, and Davy Crockett was like a folklore. No one really took him seriously. I mean, they were making plays about him already. He killed a bear when he was 5 years old. He could shoot a skunk at, so many miles, and he could do all this wonderful things that he could do. And it's a tall tale, but he got that reputation, and he was helping the country expand, and but he kept on saying, these people, he was good friends with Sam Houston, so when Sam Houston came to Washington, D.C., they would go to parties together. Both of them would see how much they could outdrink each other, and they would start arguing, but they were still friends with each other. Davy Crockett he would actually leave Congress to start a new life in Texas. That's how important he felt to him what these people were doing. When he went out there with men from Tennessee, Louisiana, Kentucky, went out there and joined the forces at the Alamo. Of course, we know at the Alamo what happened. They lose. All of everybody is killed. Women and children were allowed to leave. And that was it of the Alamo. But you always hear, remember the Alamo as a saying. And that's the reason why. Anybody have any questions right now?
What did he serve in Congress? So Davy Crockett served in Washington, D.C. He was a frontiersman of Tennessee, and then he went on to Washington, D.C. And what's in Washington, D.C.? That's where our capital is, and that's where Congress is, and that's where so how long did he serve in Congress? He was supposed to serve, he won his election, and he's supposed to do his 4 years. And he left for some reasons, and he came back, finished it up, and then he got reelected again, and he was, if I remember right, he didn't serve the rest of his last term, which had been another 4 years. But that's the reason, because he eventually moved out. But he was telling everybody about this and what they believed in, and the president at the time was listening and everything. So it was quite interesting what was happening out there. So after the Alamo and after the major battle with Sam Houston and Santa Anna, for several weeks, Santa Anna continued to negotiate with Houston over what they're going to do with Texas. Since he's the president and the general, he could pretty much make the agreement. Now, he thinks he can. You still have to have permission from your Congress or their judicial system. Negotiate with Houston. Rusk and Barnett, which were generals under Houston, Santa Anna suggests two treaties, a public version, a promise that made between two countries, and a private version that included Santa Anna's personal agreements. The treaties of Vilsaco required that all Mexican troops retreat south on the Rio Grande, and all private property, code of slaves, were respected and restored. The prisoners of war would be released unharmed, and Santa Anna was given passage to Veracruz immediately. He secretly promised to pursue the Mexican Congress to acknowledge the Republic of Texas and recognize the Rio Grande as the border between the two countries. So what that did was, he made two of them up. He's pretty much saving his rear end himself. He was saving himself. We'll give you, from the Rio Grande will be the cutoff point. This will all be your country, Republic of Texas. We will recognize it. You let my prisoners of war go. Sound good. But
Santa Anna went back to Mexico after this was all over, and went to the Congress and told them, and the Mexican government never recognized the Republic of Texas. Even during the Mexican War, they never recognized them. Now Santa Anna is kicked out of the country and sent to the Bahama area of in the Virgin Islands. And he actually stayed there, and he was exiled from Mexico there to the islands after the revolution. One thing, remember I was telling you about the land grants in the 1812. Okay, the same thing happened here for the veterans who served in the Texas independence. Veterans guaranteed land bounties in 1879. Surviving Texan veterans who served more than 3 months from October 35 to January 1837 were granted an additional 1,280 acres in public lands. Over 1.3 million acres of land were granted. Some was in Greer County, which is later determined as part of Oklahoma. So it really expanded, which is part of Oklahoma was part of Texas at one time. So the boundary line wasn't designed yet of the area of what we consider what Oklahoma is to Texas now. All right, so anybody have a question about the Texas Revolution?
How many prisoners did the other army men have? How many prisoners?
Seriously, I don't have that number, how many that the Texans and the Americans wind up capturing. I know when Santa Anna separated his forces, there were over thousands of soldiers that were captured because the Mexicans who were on the American side with Sam Houston went and burned a bridge down for they couldn't re-support their Santa Anna. And when he did that, they had to leave their cannons and everything there. The men were tattered, they were tired, didn't have anything. And those Mexican soldiers went in and with regular soldiers, and they were afraid of being shot. So what they did was, for they would know those were on the Texican side, they would actually put a card, playing card, in their hat, or a piece of cardboard or something that would identify that's how you knew they were on your side. So really, who had the upper hand? Santa Anna had more men, right? Okay. Houston was training his men leading up to the final battle, right? Alamo was already over with. But who surprised who? Who had the surprise? Houston. Houston had the surprise on St. Anna. They hit them hard, they hit them fast, they couldn't regroup, they couldn't get reinforcements, his men were tired, and that's the reason, that is the most one-day battle of a high casualty rate that we've ever been in for it took only like 18 seconds to pretty much wipe out St. Anna's army at that one battle. I mean, I've read reports where they were shooting, scalping, they were making them pay for what they did at the Alamo. Now, one of the Mexicans that was with Sam Houston, he kept on asking, he says, I need to go back to the Alamo. He says, no, you're staying here. And he kept on arguing with him. He said, no, you're with us. So he helped burn the bridge. He eventually went back to the Alamo and seen what was left. And nothing was left. The buildings were destroyed pretty much by artillery, bodies laying everywhere. He did take some of his men, and they did rebury a lot of them in there at the cemetery there in San Antonio, where the Alamo's at. You still see the graves there where they've not been moved. So they had even though they were Mexicans and the Americans were there, they felt what they were believing in to make this country bigger. So. Okay, we're going to talk about the Mexican War. The Mexican War was after the Texas Revolution. Okay, remember I told you Mexico never really considered the state of Texas and the Republic of Texas as their own country or their own state. Well, the border of Texas as an independent state was originally never settled. The Republic of Texas claimed the land up by the Rio Grande based on the treaties of Valsalco, but the Mexican refused to accept these as valid claim. The border was the Nucusa River. So now they're arguing with each other. But there's someone who's helping the Mexicans, and it's someone who we have met before in 1812 Revolutionary War, and they're actually trying to start another conflict. What country is that? We fought them twice. Who did we fight twice? The Revolutionary War and the War of 1812.
Britain. British.
British, good. Okay, now the British were telling the Mexicans, we'll help you, but we'll help you in certain ways, but you still have to do it on your own. So their president at the time was a different president, and they're starting to have problems, and they're arguing with each other, and now the United States wants to keep on moving farther west to California, Arizona, New Mexico. Well, where the line ends at, that's still Mexican territory, but we keep on moving farther west. The Americans do. So there's going to cause some problems. On November 10th, 1845, President Polk, which he was the president during the Mexican War, sent John Slidell, a secret representative, to Mexico City to offer $25 million for the Rio Grande border and Texas, the Mexican provinces of Alta California, Santa Fe, de Nuevo Mexico. The U.S. expansions wanted California, but the British was also telling the Mexicans not to do this, because they would say they were going to help at the time. And the area again on the port of the Pacific Ocean, Polk authorized Slidell to give a $3 million owed to the U.S. citizens for damages caused by the Mexican War of Independence. So they said, we'll give you money for what happened during the Texas Revolution, too. Damages caused in the Mexican War of Independence, and pay another $25 to $30 million in exchange for the two territories. Okay, so we're trying to be peaceful, and we want to move. We bought the Louisiana Purchase, right? And we won most of the other lands. But now we're actually going to another country and say, hey, we really like to move farther west. We want to go to Santa Fe, we want to New Mexico area, Arizona, California. Well, they didn't want that. And they pretty much told the United States government that, no, we're not going to take it, and so on, okay? But now the Mexicans decided that we can't let them bully us around, so now they invade over the Rio Grande. Now, the Mexicans don't believe the Rio Grande is any part of the state or the country, but the Americans do. So they send troops over the Rio Grande. They send troops up to California. There was Colonel Fremont was there with troops doing surveying the area with surveying equipment, things like that, and they started having fighting. You had the dragoons that were out there, and they started going back and forth. Well, it gets back to the United States government. President Polk's pretty upset about it. he calls up his army, which is a very small army because usually at that time we didn't need to have a great big one. But he had two generals from Mexican War that were going to fight. Zachary Taylor, which was a general, and he usually took care of the militia, state troops, some federal government troops, and then Winfield Scott, which was going to take care of all the naval, the Marines, and all the regular army. So now we got two generals, and they're going to butt heads against each other. Zachary Taylor comes in from Louisiana, comes down into Mexico, and he pretty much, any force that he kept on facing, they kept on beating him. I mean, now these are supposed to be, most of them are non-regular troops. These are state troops from Kentucky, Mississippi, New York. They're not supposed to know how to fight. Regular troops are supposed to be the ones that know how to fight. Winfield Scott's out in the Gulf of Mexico. He comes by sea with his troops. So he comes and he does a great job. But then he gets pinned down. And when he gets pinned down, Zachary Taylor pretty much had to come and save him through the Mexican War with his soldiers. And they always butted heads. And Winfield Scott, now this guy, Winfield Scott, he has fought in two major wars. The 1812, now the Mexican War. Eventually, he's going to be part of the Civil War. So now that's three that he was in. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. But now he's the head of the whole army during the Mexican War. Zachary Taylor, he does so well, he eventually runs for president after the Mexican War. Okay, remember I told you about Santa Anna being exiled out of Mexico. Okay, Santa Anna was secretly been dealing a representative of the U.S., pledging that if he was allowed back in Mexico through the U.S. naval blockades, he would work to sell all consistent territories of the United States as a reasonable price. Once back to Mexico at the head of the army, Santa Anna reneged on both agreements. He declared himself president once again and then successfully tried to fight the U.S. invasion. Well, that kind of came back and bit us, didn't it? So he left, and we said, oh yeah, you send me back there, I will tell them to take the money, we don't have to have no bloodshed, and everything. Pope and them all agreed, and first thing he does is makes himself president and general again. So, which history you will see that a lot where things like that happen. So we were fighting out in California, and eventually the Mexicans were doing pretty well, and the Indians that were out there were helping the Mexicans, and they went and they were fighting. They were fighting pretty well out there, but then eventually the Dragoons, and the Dragoons are really your first cavalry on horses. Curbs, sabers, muskets, flintlock pistol, now they're shooting. And eventually they're going to come out with a 6-shot pistol, except having the 1-shot pistol. And the 6-shot pistol was called the Colt Walker. And the one before that was called the Colt Patterson, 31 caliber, real small caliber. When he would shoot an Indian, it wouldn't knock him down. He'd get back up and start chasing you, trying to kill you. With a 44 caliber Walker, the bigger bullet, 6 shots, you get hit by that, it's going to knock you down. Now, the guy who came up with that the Colt Walker, he started a group later in history called the Texas Walker Unit, the Texas Walkers. They're the sheriff's department in there. He was the first one to come up with that pistol, 6-shot Colt Walker. So, I don't have one with me. I was going to bring it, I forgot. But if you compare a 44 caliber Remington to 44 caliber Walker. Same bullet would have been shot out, but it's more powder would have been used and the force would have been harder to hit and would have knocked you down. So now our weapon's starting to get better. So now we're going to declare war against the Mexican army, or Mexican government on May 11th, 1846. Congress approved the declaration of war on May 13th. The Southern Democrats, strong supporter, 67 Whigs, which Whig was a party back then, voted against the war on key of slavery amendment. But the final passage, only 14 Whigs voted no, including Representative John Quincy Adams. Congress declared war on Mexico on May 13th, 1846, after only having a few hours of debate. So now we are eventually in it. We've got our soldiers out in California, Mexico, coming from the north, from the east to the west, and now you got the Navy and Winfield Scott coming from the Gulf of Mexico. So, but slavery keeps on popping up in this, because we know eventually the Kansas-Nebraska Act kind of came in, and that's kind of where we're going to eventually come to a point where each state that comes in to the United States, if one was a free state, the next one was going to be a slavery state. And all we're doing at this time in the 1840s is just slapping a Band-Aid on top of this problem. And we kind of forget about it during the Mexican War, but eventually in the 1850s, 1860s, you'll see it come back up, and when the new states start coming up, that they're going to start who's going to be a southern, or who's going to be a slave state and who's going to be a free state. So now out in California, one of the battles out in California, the cavalry's out there winning, and there's a bear on the flag of the flag out in California, and it's called the Republic of California. Well, it wasn't the same way as the Republic of Texas, but they felt it that way, how strong they were to fight out there, to fight for this for the United States. And they were going to go out and win this. So actually a man who had time had a flag, and then they called it the Revolution Republic of California, which he put a bear on there, and that's how the California got their flag. One guy that was from the Civil War you'll hear about, and he fought. Now a lot of guys who this is their first time in major war. Jefferson Davis, who would eventually become the president of the Confederacy. Robert E. Lee, Colonel Price, which he was a Confederate general. Grant, McClellan, General Bragg. So these guys, you start hearing them in the Mexican War, but these were all young men. They were first lieutenants out of West Point. They just graduated when the war started. And they're going to go and fight in Mexico, get their feet wet, but the war ends. A lot of them go to duties out in California, Texas, stay in the military or get out. But then when the Civil War rolls around, now they've had that experience and know what happened. Anybody have any questions or anything right now?
Were the Texas Walkers, was that the same as the Texas Rangers? Is that
Yes.
the same?
Yeah, they eventually called them the Texas Rangers, but Walker was one of the first ones to start the group in Texas, in which they still have them around today. Okay, one of the questions on here was, what kind of artillery was used most effectively battling in the Mexican artillery? Okay, so during the Mexican War, the Mexicans would put their cannons in a row, fortify them, where they could shoot. And they were all right artillerymen. But we have a new tactic in the U.S. government that we've learned from the Europeans. And like I talked before about the Napoleonic type fighting, this is what come out of Napoleonic War style fighting. We can set our cannons up same way, shoot back at them. But the most effective way to hurt an army is to hook your artillery pieces up to horses and use it, flying artillery it's called. Cross the field, unlimber the cannon, shoot a couple times, hook up again, and you can move on the other side of the field. Wherever you needed artillery at, you can hook that cannon up and move it anywhere on the field. It's called flying artillery. So now the Mexicans are kind of stuck. They can't do that. The Americans are hooking up, going out. When the infantry's moving, they can move their artillery up. Now they can go up and start hitting them, fighting. When they need to fall back, they'll fall back. If they need to go to the right, they need to go to the left. Now they can help anywhere the American soldiers are going. The Mexicans are stuck where they're at. They can't go anywhere. They can't hook it, because if they get hooked up, they're going to get shot by the infantry, dragoons, or the artillery. So that was a major step of fighting, of Napoleonic type fighting at that time. One thing about the Mexican War, eventually the United States wins. We pretty much came to conclusions. We gave them money of what property we wanted, but we only gave them not even half of what we offered them. So they kind of came out poorly in that. If they would have took it in the first half, then they would have lost the men. They would have gained some money and everything. No. So they lost it. Zachary Taylor, after the war, he's a big hero. He runs for presidency. So does Winfield Scott. He's been in the service, so both of them run for the next election. Who wins the presidency? I just said it. Taylor. Taylor won the presidency. Now, he didn't live long enough to do his full years. He got sick and died, and eventually became president afterwards. But he was a war hero, and that's how a lot of these guys were noticed for their politics or their war heroes become presidents through the 1800s. And when David will talk about World War II, Dwight D. Eisenhower becomes president because he was a war hero. That's pretty much his popularity. But same way as in the Civil War, you have McClellan. He was supposed to be a war hero. He runs against Lincoln, loses. So now something interesting happens when we finally get the grant to California. And the Mexicans knew about it, but they kind of kept it to themselves, and they were more interested in silver. When they got to California, they found gold. The 1849s, after the Mexican War, they find the gold, and the gold rush starts. So that's what happened. So if they would have had that, we would never know about the gold rush where everybody's running out west to get their riches, and some did, some didn't. But we did gain that from the Mexicans after the Mexican War. Does anybody have any questions? No? Okay. Okay, so the handout I gave you, the land near what river was the front of the dispute to the Mexican government? What was the name of the river?
The Rio Grande?
Rio Grande. What state was Davy Crockett from?
Tennessee.
What kind of artillery was used most effectively during the battling of the Mexican artillery?
Cannons.
Okay, cannons, but what were they called? Flying artillery. What did they call the citizens of Texas territory of Mexico? Mexicans. What weapon was named after the man who carried it at the Alamo?
The Bowie knife.
Bowie knife. The Alamo was formerly used as what before the battle? Very good. You did pay attention. Good. I'm glad.
I gotta say, what about Simon Kenton? What can you talk about him? I mean, he was during that time period.
Right. Simon Kenton was born in Virginia. He was into politics, moved out west, but I didn't go into him because he is a local tie, and I was trying to.
Yeah, I understand, but I just wanted you to tell anything about it, just for them. Just for them to be, you know. I mean, he knew James Bowie.
Yeah, he did know Bowie. What I know about him was I know where he was born in Virginia. I've been to his home in Orange County, Virginia. Moved to Kentucky. He was big into politics at the time, trying to help organize the government. He did know Bowie. But everything else, I really don't know much about him because I really haven't studied much about him.
I think I mean, my kids read that book about him. Yeah, and he was in like Santa Fe and.
Yeah, he went out there a lot.
Way. Yeah.
One guy who you'll hear about during the Old West, Kit Carson's wife was out in Mexico area during the Mexican War, and they didn't. They actually let her go, and she was actually, they thought she was dead at one time, but she's seen what the Indians and the Indians were doing of killing innocent people and stuff, and she wrote about it to her husband, which he was in the military. Kit Carson was in the military at the time. So there's a lot of famous people who were in these wars. I just kind of hit the basics.
I mean, you're doing a good job.
Okay.
I just wanted you to just tell something about them.
We talked about Kings Mountain, right? During the previous, we talked about Kings Mountain. Okay, you know whose father was there fighting? Davy Crockett's father. He fought there. I just found that out. I didn't know that myself. But it was just, but when you're going through this time in history, you'll find a lot of local ties with people and other parts of history, and you'll see what they did. Like I said, during the Mexican War, a lot of these guys who were military men graduated from West Point, Stonewall Jackson, Grant, Lee, Bragg, McClellan. You'll see them later in the Civil War. And that was our first time of actually being in war. So then will we learn from what we learned in the Mexican War? Will we learn not to do it again in the Civil War? That's the question.
How did the Gadsden Purchase fit in with this? You know, that's the little section of below New Mexico that we bought from Mexico, right?
Yeah, the realignment of all the states was really interesting because Texas still considered a lot of what Colorado's and all that area, even all the way to Oklahoma, part of that. Until later, after the Civil War, during the Civil War, that's when they started narrowing off the areas. So they had to go and survey the areas. But at that time, in the 1840s, what as we consider those areas of Colorado, New Mexico, they didn't really have them lined out yet. They just kind of knew this town was called Santa Fe, the Mexican name, and they knew that's where it was. They just didn't have it marked out like you do today on a map.
I remember reading something about California, that they weren't even going to bother with it. They sent out, actually the scout was Thomas Jefferson's grandson or son-in-law.
Son-in-law.
It was a son-in-law, and then they never heard back from him and then it was kind of like just so amazing. The next week, then they discover gold after they make it a state. I mean, it's just pretty incredible how these.
Well, that's, like Lewis and Clark went out west, so they're seeing, they're finding dinosaur bones and different plants, and they're going all the way to the ocean now. Mexican War, we stopped at Louisiana, St. Louis area. We're going farther west. We're finding gold out there in 1849 in California. We're going to eventually find silver and in some of the other states. So eventually we do find that. And the military people are the ones who are scouting the area to find out what it is and learn our natural resources that we can use in there.
How long did the gold rush last?
They were still finding gold all the way through. The heyday was from 1849 to early 1850s. And then it kind of died down. Everything was kind of used up. Mm-hmm. But they did find, but some guys were lucky to find gold in the mid 1850s to the 1860s. but guys feel like they can still go down there and try to find gold.
And then I had one more.
Okay.
Can you, and I forget the number, but maybe you know, the Louisiana Purchase was such an amazing deal. I mean, how much, because the French were in such desperation to have money to fund their war that they sold it to us for just such an, how much was that per acre?
I don't remember what the price was, but I remember when we got it, we really got a really good deal on it because the French were hurting for money.
Right, I forget the acreage price. It was like 4 cents an acre or
Yeah.
something. I mean,
Yeah,
something pretty
something like
incredible,
that.
guys.
Yeah.
That's-
I brought some of my reenacting stuff that they would have used during the Mexican War. Okay, we were talking earlier about the flintlocks and eventually percussion cap. Well, I still got to load it the same way. Tear it, pour it, ram it, turn the rammer. And now, except having a flash peen here where I got to put a powder in it, I can go to half cock, put a cap on it. The cap has firm-ray mercury. And I can fire it now in the rain. When I had the flintlock, because the powder, if it got wet, more likely it wasn't going to go off. So they would use this, and this is still smoothbore, so it's like shooting a big giant shotgun. But the first rifle gun came out of the Mexican War called the Mississippi Rifle. Made at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. And Jefferson Davis issued it to his men to issue these rifles because now they're accurate up to 500 or 600 yards. I can only shoot up to 70 yards accurate with this. So they got a lot better. But this was still used. They used this all the way from the Mexican War all the way through the Civil War.
Did they have bayonets on those things?
Yes.
What kept them from cutting themselves when they're reloading?
Well, the bayonet's not sharp. The only part sharp is here. This is not sharp. If you look at its triangular shape, so if I stab you with it, it's impossible for the sew up the wound. So when I'm loading, load. Tear it, pour it. Ram charge, return rammer. Half cock, put a cap on it, full cock, fire. And then you did it all over again. So you're really never touching it up here, and that's the reason they would put it out here or out here in front of you, but it's not sharp.
I always wondered about that.
Yeah, those are not sharp. I have a coat on. If anybody wants to try the coat on, want to hold the musket, that's fine. I have some of the other gear here you can see. And does anybody else have a question?
She's got one. Yes, you do. You
Who
said
did-
you did.
Who did
Oh, he wants to ask, she wants to ask you.
graduated from the, or people that went to the military? Where did you say they graduated from?
West Point.
Thank you.
West Point or VMI. Now you got a question? No.
She's too embarrassed. She's gonna ask you later.
Well, I'm gonna ask her, yeah. not
Okay.
her.
All right. You have a question?
No.
No? Okay. So I think that's about close to our time. We've got 2 minutes. I'll let you come up and look at the